They say success is the best revenge, but I learned that revenge is even better when your success stares your enemies in the face every single morning. The house I bought sits directly across from my childhood home, a constant reminder that the daughter they dismissed as worthless now owns more than they ever will. But before I could claim that victory, before I could watch their faces drain of color as I signed those purchase documents, I had to survive the night that changed everything. Let me take you back to the moment everything shattered, the night when the fork in my hand became impossibly heavy, and I finally understood that some families are not meant to be saved. The Thompson family dining room had always felt like a courtroom where I was perpetually on trial, but that particular evening, the air itself seemed to thicken with malice, pressing against my chest until I could barely breathe. My mother sat across from me, her face arranged in that expression I had studied for 23 years, a masterclass in cruelty disguised as concern. She had perfected it over decades, that particular blend of false maternal warmth and calculated viciousness. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the sickly sweet poison I had learned to decode long before I had the vocabulary to name it. "Ivy, sweetheart, Serafina needs your room for her studio. It's time you gave it to her." 7 words that felt like a death sentence. 7 words that demanded I surrender the last piece of myself I had managed to protect. My room. Not just 4 walls and a worn carpet, but the sanctuary I had carved out of years of neglect and indifference. The birthplace of something they could never understand, the hidden laboratory where I had transformed their rejection into fuel, their dismissal into determination, their cruelty into cold, hard ambition. That room was where I had built my empire. A multi-million-dollar financial consulting firm constructed in secret brick by invisible brick during countless late nights bent over textbooks and glowing laptop screens, while my family slept peacefully, never once wondering what the forgettable daughter was doing behind her closed door. They thought I was studying for some meaningless degree, wasting time on boring numbers that would lead to an equally boring life. They had no idea I was building something that would eventually let me buy the house directly across from theirs, just so I could watch their faces every single day when they realized how spectacularly wrong they had been about me. My knuckles went white around the fork. Across from me, Serafina reclined in her chair like a queen at court, wearing that smirk I had memorized in childhood, the one that announced her victory before the war had even started. Those perfectly manicured nails, paid for with money that should have been mine, tapped lazily against her phone screen. She scrolled through her social media empire of paid followers and fake engagement, completely indifferent to the fact that my entire world was being dismantled right in front of her designer-shadowed eyes. But why would the golden child concern herself with my pain? Serafina had never fought for anything in her life. Every opportunity, every advantage, every second chance had been delivered to her with our parents' love wrapped around it like expensive gift paper, each of her failures cushioned by their endless well of excuses and explanations. My father's fist came down on the table with such force that the dishes rattled and my water glass nearly toppled over. The sound reverberated through the room like a gunshot, and for a split second everyone froze. Then his voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold as a winter blade. "This is not up for discussion. You will give up that room or you will get out of this house right now. This family has no place for useless people like you. Useless." The word landed like a physical blow, even though I should have been immune to it by now. How many times had I heard variations of that sentiment throughout my life? How many times had I been told directly or indirectly that I did not matter, that my needs were inconvenient, that my very existence was an afterthought in the grand narrative of the Thompson family? I looked at. My father really looked at him and saw a man who had never once asked me about my day, never attended a single school event that mattered to me, never offered a word of encouragement when I struggled or a moment of pride when I succeeded. Next to him, Ethan had made himself as small as possible, hunching his shoulders and staring down at his plate as if the pattern on the china held the secrets of the universe. My younger brother had perfected the art of invisibility, of fading into the background whenever conflict arose. I did not entirely blame him. He had been raised in the same toxic environment, taught from birth that Serafina was the golden child and that the rest of us existed merely to support her ascension to whatever mediocre throne she was climbing toward. But his silence hurt nonetheless. Just once I wanted someone in this family to stand up and say that what was happening was wrong. I looked around the table, taking in each face with a clarity I had never quite achieved before. My mother, with her calculating eyes and pursed lips, already mentally redecorating my room for her precious Serafina. My father, red-faced and furious that anyone would dare question his decree. Serafina barely suppressing her triumphant grin. Ethan desperately wishing he could disappear entirely. Not a single ally. Not a single person who would stand up and say that maybe, just maybe, taking away the one space I had in this house was cruel and unnecessary. Something shifted inside me then. It was not a dramatic transformation, not a thunderbolt of realization or a movie-worthy moment of awakening. It was quieter than that colder. It was the feeling of a door closing softly but firmly, the sound of a lock clicking into place. I felt my face arrange itself into a smile, slow and deliberate, and I watched with detached interest as my mother's eyes narrowed and my father's jaw clenched tighter. They recognized something in that expression, something that unnerved them even if they could not quite name it. "I understand," I said, and my voice came out eerily calm, so calm that it seemed to disturb the air around us. "Then I will leave. But don't think for a second that this is the end of anything." I stood up, pushing my chair back with measured control. I did not throw my napkin down dramatically or storm out in a fury. I simply walked away from that table, leaving behind a meal I could no longer stomach and a family I was finally ready to leave behind. The silence that followed me out of the dining room felt like death itself, heavy and absolute. Later that night, alone in the room they wanted to take from me, I allowed myself to remember. The memories came in fragments, sharp-edged pieces of a childhood that had been more absence than presence. I remembered being 7 years old, watching Serafina unwrap gift after gift on Christmas morning while I received a single book and a vague promise that maybe next year would be better. I remembered being 10, sitting alone in the cafeteria at school because my parents had forgotten to pick me up again, while Ethan was probably at home being doted on by our mother. I remembered being 14, watching my savings disappear. That memory in particular burned with a special kind of fire. $500. It had taken me 2 years of birthday money, of babysitting the neighborhood kids, of tutoring classmates in math, of every odd job I could find. $500 that I had carefully saved, dollar by dollar, quarter by quarter, dreaming of what I could do with it. Maybe a better laptop for the coding classes I wanted to take. Maybe investment in a small business idea I had been nurturing. Maybe just the security of knowing I had something that was mine, something nobody could take away. But they had taken it. I came home from school one day to find my savings jar empty, and my mother standing in the kitchen with a shopping bag from the camera store. Serafina needed a new camera for her YouTube channel, she explained, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Serafina's future was important. Serafina had potential. Serafina, Serafina, Serafina. What about my future? I had asked, my voice small and broken. My father had looked at me with such indifference that it hurt worse than anger would have. Serafina's career is taking off. You're just doing homework. You can save again. That was the moment when something fundamental broke inside me. Not shattered exactly. More like it crystallized into something harder, sharper, more focused. I remember standing there 15 years old and absolutely certain of one thing: I would never ever depend on them again. I would build something so magnificent, so undeniable, that they would have no choice but to see me. And if they still refused to look, well, that would be their loss, not mine. The room around me bore witness to that promise. Every surface was covered with evidence of my secret life, the one I had built while they were busy worshiping at the altar of Serafina's mediocrity. Financial textbooks, some borrowed from the library, some purchased used from the internet with money I had earned myself, printouts of market analyses, client portfolios, investment strategies. My laptop, old and battered but functional, sat on my desk like a trusted ally. This was my war room, my sanctuary, my proof that I was worth something, even if my own family could not see it. I had started small, of course. At 16, I began offering financial advice to classmates' parents, helping them understand their retirement accounts and optimize their savings. Word of mouth spread slowly but steadily through Richmond's middle-class neighborhoods. By 17, I had registered a small business, filing all the paperwork myself, after spending weeks learning the process. By 18, I had a dozen regular clients. By 20, that number had grown to 50. And now at 23, I had built something that even I sometimes had trouble believing was real. Thompson Financial Consulting was mine. Every client, every success story, every dollar earned was a testament to what I could accomplish when I stopped waiting for my family's approval and started betting on myself. My parents thought I spent my days doing boring number crunching for some faceless corporation. They had no idea that the boring office job I mentioned in passing was actually my own company, operating out of the very room they now wanted to strip away from me. They had no idea that I had over 300 clients across Richmond and the surrounding areas. They had no idea that my company was valued at several $1,000,000. They had no idea about any of it because they had never bothered to ask. I stayed up most of that night, not packing or planning my dramatic exit, but thinking, calculating, considering possibilities with the same analytical mind I brought to my clients' financial portfolios. By the time the sun rose, I knew exactly what I needed to do, and the first call I needed to make was to Lena Davis. Lena had been my best friend since college, but more than that, she was my business partner in all the ways that mattered. She understood numbers the way poets understood words, and she had been with me since the early days when Thompson Financial Consulting was just a fever dream and a bunch of borrowed textbooks. When my phone call woke her at 6 in the morning, she answered immediately, her voice alert despite the early hour. "Ivy, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. "Actually, everything is about to be very right. Lena, I need you to execute Plan B." There was a pause on the other end of the line. We had discussed Plan B months ago, half joking over drinks after a particularly successful quarter. It had been a fantasy, a what-if scenario born from too much wine and not enough patience with my family's endless dismissiveness. But I had meant every word of it, and Lena had known that even then. "The house across the street?" she asked. "The house across the street," I confirmed. "It went on the market last week. I want you to buy it. Cash offer. Today." Another pause, longer this time. Then Lena laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that meant she was already pulling up real estate listings on her laptop. "You're serious? You're actually doing this?" "I'm absolutely serious." "Can you make it happen? For you, I can make anything happen. Give me 2 hours." The conversation lasted another 10 minutes as we discussed price points and strategies, but I knew Lena would handle everything with her characteristic efficiency. When I hung up, I felt something unfamiliar spreading through my chest. It took me a moment to identify it: excitement. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was excited about what came next. I spent the rest of that day deliberately staying out of the house, working from a coffee shop downtown and handling client calls with perhaps more enthusiasm than usual. When I finally returned home that evening, I could feel the expectation radiating from my parents like heat from a furnace. They thought they had won. They thought I would come crawling back, defeated and compliant, ready to hand over my room and accept whatever scraps of dignity they decided to throw my way. Instead, I told them we needed to have a family meeting that weekend. My mother's eyebrows rose slightly, and I could see her mentally preparing whatever new manipulation she had planned. My father grunted something that might have been agreement. Serafina barely looked up from her phone, no doubt already mentally measuring my room for her ridiculous studio setup. The weekend came slowly each day, dragging with anticipation. I kept my routine deliberately normal, going to work, coming home, eating dinner in silence, while my family chattered around me as if I had already ceased to exist. Ethan caught my eye once or twice, and I thought I saw something like concern there, but he never spoke up. He never did. Saturday afternoon arrived with clear skies and a pleasant breeze, the kind of weather that suggested nothing momentous was about to happen. I asked everyone to gather in the living room, and they came with varying degrees of interest. My mother settled into her favorite armchair like a queen, granting an audience. My father stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, radiating impatience. Serafina sprawled on the couch, still glued to her phone. Ethan perched nervously on the edge of a chair, looking like he wanted to bolt. I stood in the center of the room, and for just a moment I let myself feel the weight of everything that had led to this point. Every dismissal, every casual cruelty, every time my achievements had been brushed aside while Serafina's mediocrity was celebrated. Every time I had swallowed my hurt and told myself it did not matter, that I did not need their approval. Every lonely birthday, every forgotten milestone, every moment when I had felt invisible in my own home. Then I let it all go. I released every bit of that hurt and let it transform into something cleaner, sharper, more powerful. I looked at each of them in turn, meeting their eyes with a steadiness I had never quite managed before. "I've made my decision," I said clearly. "I'm moving out." My mother's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. "Well, finally, it's about time you learn to take responsibility for yourself. Don't expect any help from us." "I don't," I replied simply. Then I pulled a folder from my bag and set it on the coffee table. The sound it made seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly tense room. "I'm moving into the house directly across the street. I bought it yesterday. Cash." The silence that followed was exquisite. I watched as the words penetrated their awareness, watched as their faces transformed from smugness to confusion to disbelief. Serafina's phone actually slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. My father froze mid-breath, his face slowly turning an alarming shade of red. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish yanked suddenly from water. "You," what my father finally managed. I opened the folder, spreading the papers across the table so they could all see. Deed of sale, proof of ownership, everything official and undeniable. I bought the house across the street. The sellers accepted my cash offer yesterday morning. I'll be moving in next week. Cash. My mother's voice came out strangled. Where would you possibly get that kind of money? This was the moment I had been waiting for, dreaming about, planning down to the last detail. I smiled, and this time there was nothing cold about it. This time my smile was pure, genuine satisfaction. "From my company," I said. Thompson Financial Consulting. You know that boring financial job you've always made fun of, the one you said would never amount to anything. It's not a job, it's my business. I own it. I built it from nothing, working out of that sad little room you wanted to take away from me. And it's worth several $1,000,000 now. The shock on their faces was almost comical. Almost, but not quite, because underneath my satisfaction was a thread of something darker, sadder. These people should have known. They should have cared enough to ask, to notice, to pay attention to what I was doing with my life. But they never had, and that failure was theirs, not mine. That's impossible, Serafina sputtered, finally finding her voice. You're making this up. You're lying. As if on cue, my phone rang. I had timed this perfectly with Lena down to the minute. I answered and put it on speaker. Ivy Lena's voice filled the room, bright and professional. Congratulations, the transaction just finalized. Fastest cash sale I've ever processed. You are now the proud owner of 1247 Maple Street. Welcome to the neighborhood. I watched my family's faces as the reality sank in. Watched my father's complexion go from red to ashen. Watched my mother's eyes widen with something that might have been panic. Watched Serafina's carefully constructed mask of superiority crack and crumble. Thank you, Lena, I said warmly. I'll see you Monday to finalize the furnishing plans. After I hung up, the silence stretched impossibly long. Finally, my father found his voice, though it came out weakened, uncertain. Where did you get that kind of money? Did you steal it? Are you involved in something illegal? I almost laughed at that. Of course they would assume crime before they would believe in my capability. I earned it, legally, ethically, and entirely on my own. While you were all so busy pretending I didn't exist, I was building a successful financial consulting firm. I have over 300 clients throughout Richmond and beyond. I manage portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. Companies hire me to advise their employees on retirement planning. I've been featured in 3 industry publications this year alone. But you wouldn't know any of that, would you? Because you never asked. You never cared enough to even wonder what I did with my time. Serafina tried to rally, attempted to inject her voice with its usual mocking tone. This is ridiculous. You expect us to believe that you boring little Ivy built some $1,000,000 company, please. But her voice shook, betraying her uncertainty. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life I felt nothing but pity. She had been given everything and turned it into nothing. All the attention, all the resources, all the opportunities handed to her on a silver platter, and what had she done with them? Created a mediocre streaming channel with fake followers and sponsorships built on lies. I knew about her gambling problem, about the debt she was hiding. I knew because I made it my business to know everything about my family's finances, even if they had never bothered to learn anything about mine. Believe whatever you want, I said calmly. The papers don't lie. The bank statements don't lie. My tax returns don't lie. I built this company from nothing, and I did it without a single dollar of support from any of you. Actually, that's not quite true. I did it despite you actively stealing from me. My mother flinched at that. Good. Let her remember the $500. Let her remember every time she had dismissed my dreams as foolish. Let her remember every comparison to Serafina that had left me feeling worthless. I picked up the folder, tucking it back into my bag. I used to dream about this moment. I used to fantasize about proving you all wrong, about making you see that I was worth something. But you know what? I realized I don't need your validation anymore. I don't need you to be proud of me. I don't need your approval or your acknowledgement. I built my success for me, not for you. And I'm going to move across the street and live my life, and you're going to see me every single day, and that's going to be a constant reminder of everything you failed to recognize. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Ethan was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between shock and admiration, and maybe, just maybe, a dawning realization. My parents looked like they had been hit by a truck. Serafina's face was twisted with an emotion she probably could not even name, something bitter and burning. I hope that studio works out for Serafina, I said quietly. She's certainly getting everything she wanted. I hope it makes her happy. I hope it makes all of you happy. Because I'm done trying to earn something from you that you were never going to give. Then I left. I walked out of that house with my head high and my heart lighter than it had been in years. Behind me, I could hear raised voices, the beginning of what was undoubtedly a massive argument. But it was not my problem anymore. I had freed myself from the cage of their expectations and their cruelty, and I was never going back. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Moving was surprisingly easy when you realized how little attachment you had to your previous space. I hired movers, coordinated with Lena, and slowly transformed the house across the street into something that was undeniably, unmistakably mine. Every piece of furniture I chose was a statement. Every color on the walls was a declaration of independence. Every room I designed was a middle finger to everyone who had ever made me feel small. From my new bedroom window, I could see directly into my old room. I watched as Serafina moved in, watched as she set up her ridiculous streaming equipment, watched as she primped and posed for her camera, and I felt nothing but satisfaction. She could have that room. It meant nothing anymore. Lena came over almost every day, helping with furniture placement and interior design decisions, but mostly just being there as a witness to my transformation. One evening, we sat on my new porch drinking wine and watching the sunset, and she said something I would never forget. "You know what the best revenge is?" she asked. "Living well," I offered, because that was the cliché response. She shook her head. "Better than that. The best revenge is becoming so genuinely happy that you stop thinking about revenge at all. You're almost there, Ivy. I can see it." She was right. With every day in my new house, with every morning I woke up in a space that was entirely mine, I felt the old anger and hurt loosening its grip. I was not there yet, not completely, but I could see the path forward. Of course, my family could not leave things alone. My mother called 3 times in the first week, her voice alternating between wheedling and accusatory. Why had I lied to them? Why had I hidden my success? Did I think I was better than them now? Each call was a masterpiece of projection and manipulation, and each call I ended politely but firmly. "I didn't lie to you," I told her during the 3rd call. "I simply stopped trying to make you see me. There's a difference. You never asked about my life because you never cared. That's not my responsibility to fix." My father tried a different tactic, showing up at my door unannounced one Saturday morning. I almost did not answer, but curiosity got the better of me. He stood on my porch looking older, somehow diminished. For just a moment I wondered if he was there to apologize, to acknowledge what he had done to bridge the gap between us. "This house must have cost a fortune," he said instead. "You should have invested that money more wisely. Property is a depreciating asset in this neighborhood." I laughed, then actually laughed out loud. "Dad, I'm a financial consultant. I know exactly what I'm doing with my money. This house is an excellent investment, and even if it weren't, I can afford it. Multiple times over. But thanks for your concern." He blustered for a few more minutes, trying to reassert some kind of authority, but his heart was not in it. Finally he left, and I watched him shuffle back across the street, a man who had spent so long wielding power that he did not know how to function without it. The real shock came about 3 weeks after I moved out. I was working from home reviewing a client's portfolio when I heard shouting from across the street. Loud, angry shouting that carried clearly through my open windows. I tried to ignore it at first, tried to focus on my work, but the commotion was impossible to miss. Later that day, Lena called me, her voice tight with barely suppressed excitement. "Have you been online in the last hour? No, why? Your sister is trending. And not in a good way." I pulled up Twitter, and there it was, spreading like wildfire across social media. Someone had leaked extensive documentation of Serafina's gambling debts. Screenshots of her online casino accounts showing tens of thousands of dollars lost. Records of her borrowing money from sponsors under false pretenses. Evidence of her buying followers and engagement to maintain the illusion of her streaming success. It was devastating, comprehensive, and absolutely damning. Within hours, her sponsors started pulling out. Within days, her follower count plummeted as people realized they had been watching a carefully constructed fraud. The golden child of the Thompson family, the one who had been given everything, had spectacularly self-destructed in the most public way possible. I would be lying if I said I did not feel a grim satisfaction watching it unfold, but underneath that was something more complicated. I had not caused this. I had nothing to do with the leak, though part of me wondered if karma was real after all. Serafina had built her success on sand, on lies, and borrowed money, and the blind faith of parents who refused to see her flaws. And now the tide had come in, and there was nothing left but wreckage. The phone calls from my parents became desperate after that. They needed money. Serafina needed money. Could I help? Could I understand that family was supposed to support each other? The irony was apparently lost on them, but it was not lost on me. "No," I said simply when my mother called, her voice thick with tears. "I'm not giving you money to bail out Serafina. She made her choices. She has to live with the consequences." "But we're family," my mother wailed. "You made it very clear what kind of family we are," I replied. "You chose Serafina over me every single time. You took my money to fund her dreams while dismissing mine. You demanded I give up my space for her convenience. You called me useless. So, no, I'm not interested in saving any of you from the mess you created. You're welcome to handle this the same way I handled everything when I was growing up alone." The silence on the other end was profound. Then my mother's voice turned cold, hateful. "You're a spiteful, selfish girl. We gave you everything. You gave me nothing but pain and dismissal, I said quietly. And I turned it into something beautiful. That's not spite, Mother. That's survival. Goodbye. I hung up and blocked her number. Then I blocked my father's number too. It was time to cut the rot out of my life completely. What I did not expect was the knock on my door a week later. When I opened it, Ethan stood there looking thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then his face crumpled and he started crying. I'm so sorry, Ivy. I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I should have stood up for you. I was a coward and you deserved better. I could have slammed the door in his face. Part of me wanted to. But Ethan had never been cruel, just weak. He had been raised in the same toxic environment, taught the same terrible lessons about whose value mattered. And unlike our parents and Serafina, he was here acknowledging his failure, asking for forgiveness. I let him in. We talked for hours and I learned things I had never known. How our parents had pitted us against each other deliberately. How they had told Ethan that I resented him, that I was jealous of him, that I would hurt him if given the chance. How he had been as much a pawn in their manipulations as I had been. How he wanted desperately to escape but did not know how. I want to go to college, he said quietly. I want to study engineering. But they won't pay for it unless I stay home and keep being their puppet. I'm trapped, Ivy. Just like you were. I considered him, carefully weighing my options, examining my feelings. Was I doing this because I wanted to help him or because I wanted to hurt my parents? In the end, I decided it did not matter. Ethan deserved a chance that I had never gotten. I'll help you, I said. But not directly. I'm going to set up an anonymous scholarship fund. You're going to apply to every school you're interested in, and you're going to get financial aid, and my fund is going to fill in the gaps. Our parents will never know it came from me, and in exchange you're going to work hard, get your degree, and build a life that's yours, not theirs. Deal. His eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. Deal. Thank you, Ivy. I'll make you proud. Make yourself proud, I corrected gently. That's all that matters. 2 months after I moved out, I threw a housewarming party. I invited everyone who mattered in my life, my clients, my business partners, my friends from college, my neighbors, the people who had supported me and believed in me when my own family could not be bothered. The house filled with laughter and music and genuine warmth, all the things that had been so conspicuously absent from the house across the street. Through the window, I could see my parents' house dark and quiet. I knew they were in there, could practically feel them watching, seething at my happiness. The for sale sign had gone up in their yard the week before. They were selling the house to pay off Serafina's debts, downsizing to a small apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. The mighty Thompsons, brought low by their own terrible choices and favorite child's spectacular failures. Lena found me standing by the window looking out at the gathering dusk. She handed me a glass of champagne and clinked hers against mine. To leaving shadows behind, she said. To building a future worth living, I replied. We drank and I turned away from the window, away from the past and back toward the party, toward the people who had chosen to be in my life and who I had chosen in return. Ethan was there laughing with some of my work colleagues, already looking healthier and happier than I had seen him in years. His acceptance letter to MIT was coming next week. I knew because I had made certain of it. The night grew late, and eventually people began to leave, thanking me for a wonderful evening, congratulating me on my beautiful home, expressing admiration for everything I had built. When the last guest had gone and it was just Lena, Ethan, and me sitting on the porch, Ethan said something that I had been waiting my whole life to hear. You're incredible, Ivy. I always knew you were special, but I didn't understand how much until now. Thank you for not giving up on me. I almost did, I admitted. But then I realized that you deserved a chance to choose a different path. We don't have to repeat the mistakes of our parents. The three of us sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Across the street, a single light turned on in what used to be my parents' house, a small yellow rectangle in the darkness. I felt nothing looking at it. No anger, no satisfaction, no longing. Just a quiet acknowledgement that that part of my life was over. What happens now? Lena asked. Are you happy, Ivy? Really happy. I thought about the question seriously. Was I happy I had my revenge, if that was what you wanted to call it? I had proven everyone wrong, had built something magnificent from nothing, had watched my tormentors face consequences for their actions. But was I happy? The answer surprised me. I'm getting there. I'm not holding on to the anger anymore. It's starting to feel like someone else's story, something that happened to a different version of me. The version of me that lives here in this house with this life I've built, she's happy. Or at least she's on her way to being happy. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. That's all any of us can ask for, I think. A chance to be happy on our own terms. Wise words from someone so young, I teased gently. "I learned from the best," he replied, and the sincerity in his voice made my throat tight. The weeks turned into months, and my new life settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. My business continued to grow, and I hired 2 new consultants to help manage the client load. I started teaching a financial literacy course at the community college, wanting to help people avoid the kind of financial exploitation I had experienced as a teenager. I made new friends, pursued new hobbies, and slowly, carefully learned to trust people again. The house across the street sold 3 months after the sign went up. A young family moved in with 2 small children and a golden retriever who barked joyfully at squirrels. I watched them from my porch, sometimes watched the children play in the yard that had once been so solemn and quiet, and I felt glad that some happiness was finally residing in that space. My parents moved to their apartment across town, and I never visited. Serafina, from what I heard through the grapevine, had taken a job at a retail store and was slowly, painfully rebuilding her life without the cushion of parental support and stolen money. I felt no particular pleasure in her downfall anymore, just a distant acknowledgement that actions have consequences. Ethan thrived at MIT, calling me every week to share his excitement about his classes, his friends, his future. In him, I saw the redemption arc that was possible when you chose to break free from toxic patterns. He was proof that we were not doomed to repeat our parents' mistakes, that we could choose differently, do better, be better. One evening, almost a year after I moved out, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when a car pulled up across the street. My parents emerged older and more worn than I remembered. They stood by the car for a long moment, looking at the house they had lost, and then slowly they turned to look at me. For a moment our eyes met across the distance. I saw something in their faces that might have been regret, might have been longing, might have been nothing more than the bitterness of people confronting the consequences of their own choices. My father raised his hand slightly, a gesture that could have been a wave or simply an aborted movement. My mother's face was unreadable in the fading light. I did not wave back. I did not look away either. I simply sat there, a woman in full possession of her own life, on the porch of a home she had earned through her own merit, and I let them look. Let them see what they had lost by refusing to see me when it mattered. Let them understand finally that their approval was no longer currency I traded in. After a long moment, they got back in their car and drove away. I never saw them again. Well, that is not entirely true. I saw them once more 2 years later at Ethan's graduation from MIT. He had invited me personally, had made it clear that I was the family member he wanted there, the one who had made his success possible. I sat in the audience, my heart swelling with pride that had nothing to do with blood relation and everything to do with watching someone I cared about achieve their dreams through hard work and determination. My parents were there too, sitting several rows behind me. We did not speak. We did not acknowledge each other beyond a brief nod. Serafina had not come, I noticed, and I wondered if the rift between her and the rest of the family had grown too wide to bridge, or if she simply could not bear to witness Ethan's success when her own life had become so diminished. After the ceremony, Ethan found me in the crowd and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I did it, Ivy. I actually did it." "You did it," I agreed, my voice thick with emotion. "You should be so proud of yourself." "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, pulling back to look at me seriously. "The scholarship, the support, just knowing that someone believed in me, you gave me that. You gave me everything. I gave you a chance, I corrected, you did the rest. That's all on you, Ethan. That success is yours." We went to dinner with Lena and some of Ethan's college friends, and the evening was filled with laughter and celebration and plans for the future. Ethan had accepted a position at a prestigious engineering firm in Boston. He was launching his own life free from the toxic patterns of our childhood, and I could not have been prouder. As I drove home that night back to Richmond and the life I had built there, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come. The girl who had sat at that dinner table being told she was useless, that her room would be taken away, that she did not matter in the grand scheme of the Thompson family narrative, that girl felt like a distant memory. She still existed somewhere inside me, I supposed, but she had been transformed by fire and determination into someone stronger, more sure of herself, more aware of her own worth. My company continued to flourish. Thompson Financial Consulting had expanded beyond Richmond, with satellite offices in 3 other cities and a staff of 15 highly qualified consultants. We had been featured in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. I had been invited to speak at financial conferences, had been interviewed on podcasts, had built a reputation as someone who genuinely cared about helping people achieve financial security and independence. But more than the professional success, more than the money or the recognition or the proof that I had been right all along, what mattered most was the peace I had found. The anger that had burned so hot in the beginning, the desire for revenge that had fueled my initial decisions, all of that had gradually transformed into something quieter, more sustainable. I had learned to let go of the bitterness, to release the grip of past hurts, to build a life based on what I wanted rather than what I was running from. I still lived in the house across from my childhood home, but I barely thought about the symbolism anymore. It was simply my house, the place where I felt safe and comfortable and entirely myself. The young family who lived across the street were friendly neighbors, nothing more, nothing less. The past that building represented had faded into irrelevance. Lena remained my closest friend and most trusted business partner. She had been there through every stage of my transformation, had witnessed my darkest moments and celebrated my greatest triumphs. One evening, about 3 years after I had moved out of my parents' house, we were having dinner at a new restaurant downtown, and she asked me a question that made me pause. Do you ever regret how things went down with your family? Do you wish you had handled it differently? I considered the question, carefully turning it over in my mind like a complicated financial problem that required analysis from multiple angles. I regret that it had to happen at all, I finally said. I regret that I was born into a family that could not see my value, that chose favoritism over fairness, that created an environment where I had to fight so hard just to exist. But do I regret standing up for myself? Do I regret leaving when I did the way I did? No, not for a second. Even knowing how much pain it caused, even knowing that your parents lost their house, that Serafina's life fell apart, that everything changed so dramatically they caused their own pain, I said firmly. I didn't force Serafina to gamble away money she didn't have. I didn't force my parents to enable her behavior or to steal from me or to treat me like I was less than. They made choices, and those choices had consequences. I'm not responsible for protecting them from the natural outcomes of their own actions. Lena nodded slowly. You've come a long way, Ivy. From the woman who sat in that coffee shop 3 years ago practically vibrating with rage and hurt to this version of you is remarkable. This version of me is free, I replied. That's the difference. I'm not carrying their baggage anymore. I'm not defined by their rejection or their approval. I'm just me living my life on my own terms, and that's more valuable than any revenge could ever be. The conversation shifted to other topics, but her question stayed with me. Had I changed? Absolutely, but I had not become someone new. I had simply become more fully myself, the version of me that had always existed underneath the layers of hurt and rejection and desperate longing for acceptance. I had shed the skin of the girl who needed her parents' love and emerged as the woman who understood that some people are incapable of giving what you need, and that is their limitation, not yours. 5 years after I left my parents' house, I received an unexpected letter. It was from my mother, handwritten on plain paper, and it sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I could bring myself to open it. When I finally did, I found myself reading words I had once desperately wanted to hear. She apologized. She admitted that she had been wrong, that she had failed me as a mother, that she had allowed her own insecurities and favoritism to damage our relationship beyond repair. She acknowledged the theft of my savings, the dismissal of my dreams, the constant comparisons to Serafina that had made me feel worthless. She said she understood if I could never forgive her, but she wanted me to know that she saw her mistakes now, that losing me had taught her lessons she wished she had learned sooner. I read the letter 3 times, waiting for the surge of emotion I expected. Triumph, perhaps, or vindication, or even the rekindling of old wounds. But what I felt was something much quieter, much sadder. I felt pity for a woman who had wasted so many years on destructive patterns, who had lost a daughter because she could not see past her own biases, who had learned her lesson only after the price had been paid in full. I wrote back eventually, not right away because I needed time to process my feelings, to understand what I wanted to say and what I owed her, if anything. When I finally put pen to paper, I was honest in a way I could never have been at that dinner table 5 years ago. I told her that I appreciated her apology, that I believed she was sincere, that I understood people could change and grow. But I also told her that forgiveness was not the same as reconciliation, that acknowledging harm was not the same as repairing it. I told her that I had built a life I loved, surrounded by people who valued me, and that life did not have room for the kind of relationship we used to have. I wished her well. I hoped she found peace. But I made it clear that I was not interested in rebuilding a mother-daughter relationship that had never really existed in the first place. Her response when it came was brief and gracious. She thanked me for my honesty, said she understood, and promised not to intrude on my life again unless I reached out first. True to her word, I never heard from her again. The door I had closed remained closed, and I felt no need to reopen it. My father never apologized. I did not expect him to. Men like him rarely acknowledged their mistakes, too, invested in the armor of their own righteousness to admit vulnerability. I heard through Ethan that he had grown bitter in his old age, still convinced that I had somehow betrayed the family by refusing to sacrifice myself for Serafina's sake. I felt nothing about this information except a distant sadness for a man who would die, never understanding what he had lost. Serafina sent me a friend request on social media one day about 6 years after I had left. I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the accept button, trying to decide what I felt. Curiosity mostly. What did she want? What was her life like now? Had she changed at all? In the end, I declined the request, not out of spite or anger, but out of self-preservation. Serafina represented a version of my life I had worked too hard to leave behind. Letting her back in, even in the peripheral way that social media allowed, felt like opening a window to a house I had burned down. There was nothing there for me anymore, nothing I needed or wanted, and that was okay. We did not have to be connected just because we shared DNA and a traumatic childhood. Ethan told me later that Serafina was doing better, that she had gotten help for her gambling addiction, that she was working a steady job and slowly rebuilding her finances. I was glad for her in an abstract way. I did not wish her ill. I simply did not wish to be part of her story anymore, just as I had removed her from mine. The years continued to pass, and my life filled with richness that had nothing to do with my net worth or professional success, though those continued to grow as well. I traveled to places I had only dreamed about as a child, walked through museums and historic sites and beautiful landscapes with the freedom that came from not having to justify my choices to anyone. I dated occasionally, though I found that relationships moved slowly for me, that trust was something I built brick by careful brick rather than offering freely. That was okay too. I had learned that being selective was not the same as being closed off, that protecting my heart was an act of wisdom, not fear. I adopted a dog, a rescue named Charlie, who had been abandoned by his previous family, and who understood in his own way what it meant to start over. He became my constant companion, greeting me at the door every evening, sitting by my feet while I worked, reminding me daily that love did not have to be complicated or conditional. Charlie loved me simply because I existed, because I fed him and walked him and scratched behind his ears. There was something profoundly healing in that uncomplicated devotion. Lena got married, and I stood beside her as her maid of honor, watching her promise forever to a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. At the reception, slightly tipsy on champagne and sentiment, she pulled me aside and said, "You're going to find this too, you know, someone who sees you the way Marcus sees me. Someone who understands how incredible you are." Maybe I said, smiling. "But if I don't, that's okay too. I'm not incomplete without a partner, Lena. I'm whole all on my own." "I know you are," she replied, hugging me tightly. "That's what makes you so extraordinary. You don't need someone to complete you, but you deserve someone who enhances the already amazing life you've built." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps someday I would find that person. But in the meantime, I had work that fulfilled me, friends who understood me, a brother who had become my family in the truest sense, and a life that I had crafted exactly to my specifications. That was more than enough. Ethan got engaged to a wonderful woman named Sarah, someone he had met at his engineering firm. She was smart and kind and genuinely funny, and she treated Ethan with the respect and care he deserved. When he asked me to be at their wedding, to stand on his side because I was the family that had mattered, I cried tears of joy. This young man, who had been so lost and complicit in his own way, had grown into someone I admired deeply, someone who had broken the cycle and chosen a different path. At their wedding, a small, intimate affair with only close friends and Sarah's family in attendance, I gave a toast that surprised even me with its emotion. I talked about the courage it takes to change, about the strength required to acknowledge past mistakes and grow beyond them, about the power of choosing your own family rather than simply accepting the one you were born into. When I finished, there was not a dry eye in the room, and Ethan hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. "You saved my life," he whispered. "I need you to know that. You saved me, Ivy." "No," I whispered back. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a little push in the right direction." 1 decade after I left my parents' house, I found myself standing on my porch on a warm summer evening, glass of wine in hand, Charlie snoring softly at my feet. The neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of children laughing in the distance and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. My house, which had once been a symbol of defiance and revenge, had become simply home. The place where I belonged, where I was safe, where I was utterly and completely myself. I thought about the girl I had been sitting at that dinner table being told she was useless and unwanted. I thought about the rage that had burned in her chest, the determination that had driven her to build an empire out of spite and hurt. I thought about how far I had come, how much I had changed, how different my life looked now compared to that terrible night when everything had fallen apart. And I realized something profound: I was grateful. Not for the pain, not for the rejection, not for the years of feeling invisible and unworthy, but for what it had taught me about my own strength, about my capacity to survive and thrive despite circumstances designed to crush me. My family's cruelty had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the absolute certainty that I could depend on myself, that I was capable of building something beautiful from nothing, that my worth was inherent and not dependent on anyone else's recognition. I had not just survived my childhood, I had transcended it. I had taken every lesson, every hurt, every moment of dismissal and transformed it into fuel for becoming the woman I was always meant to be. The version of me who stood on this porch successful and content and finally at peace with herself was someone that frightened girl at the dinner table could never have imagined. And that was the real victory, the real revenge, if you wanted to call it that. Not that I had hurt the people who hurt me, but that I had refused to let their toxicity define the shape of my entire life. The phone in my pocket buzzed and I pulled it out to see a text from Lena. Client dinner ran late. Still on for brunch tomorrow, I smiled and typed back a quick affirmative. Tomorrow I would sit across from my best friend and business partner, and we would laugh about nothing and everything, and I would return to the life I had built, the work I loved, the routines that brought me joy. Charlie stirred at my feet, lifting his head to look at me with those soulful brown eyes that asked the eternal question, walk or treat. I laughed and scratched behind his ears. Walk, I decided. Let's go explore our kingdom, buddy. As we headed down the porch steps and onto the sidewalk, I glanced back at my house one more time. In the golden light of the setting sun, it looked warm and welcoming, every window glowing with possibility. It was not the house across from my parents' place anymore. They were long gone, moved to a different city, living different lives that no longer intersected with mine. This was simply my house, my sanctuary, my proof that you could start from nothing and build everything that mattered. I had learned so many lessons on this journey. I had learned that family was not always the people you shared blood with, but the people who showed up for you when it mattered. I had learned that revenge was far less satisfying than simply living well, that the best way to defeat people who wanted to see you fail was to succeed so spectacularly that their opinions became irrelevant. I had learned that healing was not a destination but a process, that some wounds would always leave scars, but scars were just evidence that you had survived something meant to destroy you. Most importantly, I had learned that I was enough. Just me exactly as I was, without modification or apology. I did not need my parents' approval or Serafina's acknowledgement or anyone else's validation. I was valuable because I existed, because I tried, because I kept moving forward even when the path was steep and the darkness was thick. That knowledge, that bone-deep certainty of my own worth, was the real treasure I had gained from this entire experience. Charlie and I walked through the neighborhood as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Children were being called in for dinner. Couples sat on porches, enjoying the evening air. The world continued its eternal rotation, indifferent to individual struggles and triumphs, and somehow that was comforting. My story was not unique. Countless people had overcome worse, had climbed higher from deeper pits, had transformed pain into power. I was simply one more person who had refused to stay broken, who had chosen to become something more than the worst things that had ever happened to her. When we returned home, I fixed myself a simple dinner and ate it slowly, savoring each bite and the quiet peace of my own company. I responded to a few work emails, reviewed a client proposal that needed my approval, made notes for a presentation I was giving the following week. The ordinary rhythms of a life well lived, full of purpose and meaning, and the satisfaction of work done well. Before bed, I stood at my bedroom window and looked out at the street below. The house across from mine, the one that had once held so much significance, was dark and quiet. A different family lived there now, creating their own memories, building their own story. The ghosts of my past no longer haunted that space. They had been exorcised by time and distance, and my own determination to move forward rather than backward. I thought about writing in my journal, something I had started doing as part of my healing process and had maintained over the years. But tonight I did not feel the need to process or analyze or memorialize. Tonight I simply felt content. Peaceful, complete in a way that had nothing to do with any other person and everything to do with finally being comfortable in my own skin. As I climbed into bed, Charlie curling up at my feet with a contented sigh, I realized something that made me smile in the darkness. I had stopped thinking about my family months ago. Not deliberately, not as an act of will or determination, but simply because they had ceased to be relevant to my daily life. They had faded into the background, become part of history rather than an active presence in my thoughts. That was the true measure of how far I had come, not that I had forgiven them or forgotten what they had done, but that I had moved so completely beyond it all that they simply did not matter anymore. The last thought I had before sleep claimed me was not about revenge or justice or any of the emotions that had driven me in the beginning. It was simply this: tomorrow would be another good day in a life full of good days, and I had built every bit of it myself. Nobody could take that away from me. Nobody could diminish what I had accomplished or the person I had become. I had won. Not because I had destroyed my enemies or because I had proven them wrong or because I had achieved material success beyond their wildest dreams. I had won because I had created a life worth living, because I had learned to value myself exactly as I was, because I had transformed poison into medicine and pain into strength. I had won because I was happy, genuinely and deeply happy, and that happiness had nothing to do with anyone who had once tried to make me feel small. As consciousness began to slip away, I felt the last embers of that old consuming anger finally extinguish themselves. What remained was not emptiness, but something I had never expected to find: peace. The kind of peace that comes not from winning battles, but from realizing you have already won the war by refusing to let it define you. The fire that had once roared through me with such destructive fury, fueled by every slight and every wound, had undergone a quiet alchemy I had not noticed happening. It had transformed into something sustainable, something life-giving. A steady flame that warmed instead of scorched, that illuminated paths forward instead of burning bridges behind me, that powered a life I had built brick by deliberate brick, according to blueprints only I could see. That was when I understood what revenge truly meant, at least for me. It was not the house that stood as a monument to their blindness. It was not the business that proved my worth in seven-figure valuations. It was not even the satisfaction of watching them face consequences they had sown with their own hands. Those things were merely the scenery, the stage dressing of a much deeper transformation. The real revenge, the kind that actually healed instead of merely inflicting wounds in return, was this. I had taken every poison they had fed me and alchemized it into medicine. I had survived what was meant to break me, and in surviving had discovered reserves of strength I never knew existed. I had thrived in soil they swore was barren. And somewhere along this winding road, from that suffocating dinner table to this peaceful bedroom, I had accomplished the most radical act of defiance possible. I had learned to love myself, not despite my scars, but because of everything those scars represented. The woman I had become, forged in fire and tempered by rejection, was someone I was genuinely proud to be. My parents had wanted to make me small, to keep me in a box labeled worthless and forgettable. Instead, they had inadvertently taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that my worth had never been theirs to determine. It had always been mine to claim, and I had claimed it with both hands and never let go. Everything else I realized in that liminal space between waking and dreams was just the story I would tell someday. The house, the money, the dramatic revelations and satisfying downfalls, those were just plot points in a narrative that was ultimately about something much simpler and infinitely more profound. It was about a girl who decided she mattered even when no one else would say it. A girl who bet everything on herself and won. And that, I thought, as sleep finally pulled me under like a gentle tide, was not just a happy ending. It was the only ending that had ever mattered. The one where I got to wake up tomorrow and every day after, comfortable in my own skin, at peace with my choices, and genuinely excited about a future I was still writing with my own hand. They had tried to author my story for me, these people who shared my blood but never understood my heart. But in the end, I had taken the pen from their hands and written something far better than they ever could have imagined. A story where the unwanted daughter became the architect of her own destiny, where pain transformed into power, and where the final chapter read simply: she lived, she loved herself, and she was free. That was enough. That was everything.